So I'm going to look, as I usually do, for two volunteers, if I could. We're going to read Genesis 19. If one person could read through to verse 22, please. And one person could read from 23 to the end. Did I hear somebody volunteer?
Was it 19 to what, John? The first?
No, chapter 19, 1 to 22.
Right.
And then somebody, are you going to do that, Adrian?
I'll do that, yes.
Thank you, brother. Gillian, could you do the second half of the chapter?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. 23 to the end. Thanks very much.
I've done it, but sometimes my eyes don't focus.
Oh, no, thanks, Mary. Don't worry.
Right. First reading is chapter 19, verse 1. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Because I have two daughters, you have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man, Lot, and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in your city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, and the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is in a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one, and my life will be saved?" He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor. Alas, also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar.
Thank you, Adrian.
The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now Lot went up of Zoar. To stop there, John?
No, keep going, yeah, please. Yeah, thank you.
Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters, and the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son, and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son, and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day.
Thank you, Gillian. It's great. It's a really challenging chapter, isn't it? It's one we know quite well, or at least much of it quite well, but there's quite a lot of detail in here that is really quite disturbing and uncomfortable. So what I want to do is I just want to run through the chapter, the story, the narrative, as we sort of usually do, just make sure we're saying everything, and then look at 3 particular lessons from this as we look at God, as we look at Sodom, and as we look at Lot, and see what the implications are for us, and then we can chat about it. So let me just bring up a couple of slides here, just to start with, just remind you where we are on our timeline. We're here. This is the chapter here. We're looking at chapter 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's the same time, roughly within, well, we know this is within a day of where we were last week in Genesis 18, when the three visitors appear to Abraham and Sarah at Mamre, where they're based. So we're in 2067 BC. Abraham is 99 years old and Sarah is 89 years old. So that's where we are in the timeline of Abraham's life. This is the map. There's Mamre there, just above Hebron, where Abraham and Sarah live. That's their base. They will have had quite a big, we would almost call it an estate today. He was a very wealthy man with lots and lots of servants and large household. So it had been quite a considerable size place, but that's where he's based. And Sodom and Gomorrah and this area is over here. So there's Zoar, just where that red spot is, which is where Lot and his daughters go to before Sodom and Gomorrah actually destroyed. But it's around about this area that's the most precise we can be. And you'll notice there that Moab is referred to in verse, so I just lost it for a moment, in verse 37, one of the sons of the two daughters. So this is where the people of Moab settled. And this is Ammon, which is the other nation that came from that terrible situation. Ben-Ami was the father of the people of Ammon. And just put up, so here's Mamre. So when the angels left Abraham, having, remember the two angels and the Christophany, Christ himself, meet with Abraham in chapter 18. And then we read in chapter 19 that the two angels come to Sodom. So they will have taken this route here, something like it's a fairly well-known route around the end here up to Sodom, and here's Gomorrah. So this whole area, and then there's Zoar again, to which Lot and his daughters fled. So that's just again to keep reinforcing this is real people in real place in real time. So we're looking at the lesson tonight, which is true faith flees. And it's a quite disturbing lesson as we look at Lot himself. So I'm just going to stop the share here, bring back, okay. So just have that chapter open with you, and we'll follow it through and follow the storyline and then draw out some lessons from it. So having left Abraham at Mamre, the two angels continue their journey. They come to Sodom in the evening of that day. Sodom is the largest of the cities in that area, and it's evening time. And notice in verse 1, the Lot is sitting in the gate of Sodom. That's a really important phrase, because that tells us the gate was where the leading men of the city would sit, and they'd sit there to carry out local business. If you wanted someone to judge between a dispute, if you want to carry out a legal transaction, you would go to the gate of the city, and the elders, the leaders, would be there. You may remember that happened towards the end of the story of Ruth, and you can look that up if you want, in Luke chapter 4. So what this tells us is that Lot, although an outsider, or to use a nice phrase, the incomer, he's not a local in that sense, he has risen to a position of some prominence and importance in Sodom. So he's numbered among the leaders of this city. And as was custom, of course, when these men come, and of course Lot doesn't realize who they are, that he doesn't realize they're angels, he in the natural way, in verse 2, he extends a warm invitation of hospitality to them, and he won't take no for an answer. It's the done thing. If you're offered hospitality, you decline it to start with, and you have a sort of bartering arrangement, if you like, or you have to be persuaded. It would be impolite to jump too quickly at the offer of a free meal and bed and board. So there's a little bit of discussion goes on, but Lot presses them, and they go to his house, and he makes them a feast, and they ate, and they're going to spend the night there. But of course, from verse 4, the story turns really, really nasty. And this little incident reveals the utter depravity of the situation in Sodom, which we know was extended to the surrounding towns and cities as well. And the problem in Sodom and Gomorrah was one of sexual perversion. We know that from the text here. But there's also an interesting verse in the little letter of Jude, which talks about the people of Sodom who, quote, indulged in sexual immorality. Now, that word there, just to be really upfront about this for a moment as we look at that word, literally, it's a difficult one to translate in English, but it means to yield freely to indulge in excessively. So they indulged. So here are people who cast off all restraints. They abandon themselves to a lifestyle of sexual immorality and perversion. They've thrown themselves into it. But it also says in Jude that they pursued unnatural desire. Now, again, that's an English translation, a difficult phrase in the original. Literally, it means that they pursued different or strange flesh. Now, I don't think that's just referring to the homosexual element of their sexual perversion. We know from the story of the angels who visited Lot and his family that was true. But even perhaps, if I could use this phrase, heterosexual perversions, and perhaps even bestiality and other forms of sexual depravity. That's this strange flesh. So what we're looking at is a picture of utter degradation, utter depravity, and not just one or two people, but from the narrative we have here is that all the men, and even allowing for a certain amount of legitimate hyperbole, this is the common way of life of the people who live in that town and in the surrounding community. And they want, of course, to come and take advantage of the two visitors who are staying with Lot. Lot, out of sheer desperation and fear, offers his two virgin daughters as substitutes for his honored guests. And even given the cultural norms of the day of hospitality, this seems a completely irrational and unjustifiable suggestion. And you wonder what's happened to Lot's personal values and standards that he would offer his own daughters to satisfy the sensual appetites of this mob at his door. And when that strategy fails, the angels intervene from verse 10, and they pull Lot back into the house. He's negotiating at the door, of course, and they pull him back to safety, and they strike the men who are on the outside with blindness so they can no longer see what's going on. And then they reveal to Lot the purpose of their mission. They've come to destroy the place, and they extend an offer of deliverance to him and to his family, including even the sons-in-law, who must have been perhaps two of these men on the outside. We don't know, but it suggests that all the men were there. But nonetheless, he has future sons-in-law. They're called sons-in-law because they would probably have been betrothed at this stage, which is still a legally binding arrangement, as of course with Joseph and Mary in the New Testament. But his future sons-in-law think that he's jesting and don't take it very seriously. Then early the next morning, from verse 15 onwards, Lot, his wife, and his daughters still needed some persuasion to leave the city. But they did so, although Lot, of course, negotiates an alternative destination, asking and being granted permission to go to Zoar rather than to the hills in order to avoid the destruction. And notice verse 16, isn't this telling? He was reluctant, he lingered, and the two men seized him and his wife. They had to literally take him by the shoulders, by the scruff of the neck. He's reluctant to go from the city, even though he's just been told what's going to happen by the way of destruction. So as they reach verse 25, 23, I beg your pardon, as they reach Zoar, sulfur and fire from the Lord came out of heaven. Interesting phrase, we'll look at in a moment. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the land. So although only Sodom and Gomorrah are actually mentioned, probably because they're the largest, we know there are actually 4 cities in that part of the world. We know that from Genesis 14. Remember the battles with the kings from the east. Difficult to know exactly what happened here in terms of the precise nature of the judgment. Some people have suggested volcanic eruptions. Some people have suggested an earthquake, though there's little evidence for that. But I think what would make sense here is that we know that in that area, again, going back to Genesis 14, there were large bitumen or tar pits that were a natural feature of that land. And what may have happened, because there's this very specific phrase that he rained sulfur and fire out of heaven, perhaps there were massive lightning strikes from heaven that God used to light the bitumen, the tar pits that were in the ground there. And the blast would lift a whole section of the valley floor into the air, dropping it down, burying everything in its path with oil and sulfur. And it could be that in as little as 1 hour, they were all gone. In one sense, the technical details don't matter too much, other than we can say it's completely possible what's just been spelled out for us. But the picture is one of horrifying destruction. But Lot's wife, we're told, of course, in verse 26, following him rather than keeping up with him, notice, looks back for whatever reason. It suggests a sort of lingering affection and contact. And she's consumed by the elements raining down on the city. And notice in verse 27, Abraham went early in the morning to the place where it stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked up, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. Now, if you remember that map, Abraham is about 35 to 40 miles away, looking down over the valley across the water there, and he sees what's going on there. And then from verse 30, Lot and his daughters don't stay very long in Zoar, possibly because they feared it might be the object of God's judgment as well. And so they take refuge in one of the many caves in that area. And none of this family, Lot, his wife, the daughters, none of them come out of this whole story, never mind this little incident, looking good. Neither Lot, for allowing his daughters to get him so drunk, nor his daughters for their incestuous plan and action, motivated, probably, this is maybe hard for us to understand why they felt the need to do this, but probably motivated because of a fear of the disgrace of remaining unmarried and childless, which would have been a cultural, no-no for them. And of course, we ought to also remember, I'm not for a moment, by the way, in any way condoning it, I'm just trying to see it in their cultural perspective. Marriage relationships had not yet been codified by the law of God. And what we would call today polygamy and incest would not have seemed so abhorrent as it does to us today. It's not until, for example, the Ten Commandments, these things become really laid down in law. And initially, in the early parts of Genesis, certainly, the world was populated through what you and I would call today incest and polygamy. It's the only way it could happen if there's only one couple to start with. But still, the situation here is a very unpleasant and unwholesome one. And of course, the son born to the older daughter was named Moab, which means from the father. And the younger daughter's child was called Ben-Ami, which means son of my people. And those two tribes, those two nations, Moab and Ammon, lived in the mountainous regions, as I showed you on the map, to the east of the Dead Sea, and were frequently at war with Israel over the coming years. And Ruth, who is, of course, a great ancestress of Christ, a grandmother of King David, was a Moabite. So even out of this terrible situation, God still brings some good in the sense of that particular situation. Mm-hmm. Now, we'll talk about some of the implications there, some of the significance of some of that. But just as we look at the storyline, I'm sure most of that or much of that was familiar to you. You've read it a few times, you've heard stories about it. Anything particularly grabs you this evening that you hadn't really struck you before, or something that really jars in your head, and how can we make sense of that before we unpack it a little bit in terms of its significance and implication?
Pauline just said, as you're going to talk, I'm going to leave. So that puts my question in perspective.
What a wise woman.
But one thing I was just thinking of, just as that last section there, with these two incestual children becoming these two tribes, Moses is writing this, obviously before the promised land, because he didn't get to go to the promised land. So he's writing this in the wilderness on the journey towards Canaan. How does he know these tribes? Were they there in the days of Moses?
Well, this takes place roughly 2067. Moses is writing about 650 years later.
Mhm.
So within that time, these nations would have been established. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So just how does Moses himself know about it? Obviously, he had a good education in Egypt and stuff, but they haven't gone that far into.
Okay.
Well, I suppose he went. I suppose he was in. Yeah. Never mind.
Well,
just
you
thinking
see,
the area where he lived with Jethro would have probably covered some of these tribes would have been known.
Yeah, and on their journey up to the promised land, and we know this from either Numbers or Deuteronomy, I can't remember now, they went through or tried to go through Moab and Ammon. And of course, these people are very, very distant cousins, especially by 650 years later. So, and I don't think there'd be any doubt that Moses would know this story. And of course, these stories are passed down through oral tradition from one generation to another. So I don't think there's any surprise or question that Moses would know this stuff. And he's writing with the benefit of hindsight. We saw a little example of that, by the way, back in chapter let me see if I can find it very quickly. Yeah, in chapter 13 of Genesis, remember when Abraham and Lot separate, and Abraham says to Lot, what do you want to take? And verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. And you can imagine people in Moses' day saying, hang on a minute, we know that part of the world. It's not green and fertile. It's a desolate waste. And so Moses puts in brackets, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Try and imagine what it was like beforehand is what he's saying. That's why Lot chose it. Because the people, Moses' contemporaries say, why would anybody choose that bit of land? It's just a waste now. So these are little insights of editorial comment by Moses, quite a few hundred years after the event. Anything else strike you tonight that it's almost if you'd never read that passage before? Sometimes that happens to us, doesn't it?
Yes. I was just reading here a comment that's about the Sodom and Gomorrah and the fact of the destruction. It says that archaeological evidence points to an advanced civilization in this area during Abraham's day. Most researchers also confirm some kind of sudden and devastating destruction. It is now widely thought that the buried city lies between the waters of the southern end of the Dead Sea. The story of Sodom reveals that the people of Lot's day had to deal with the same kind of repulsive and the world faces today. We should follow Abraham's example of trusting God. His selfless faith contrasts with the self-gratifying people of Sodom. So it's just to say that city, what they must have archaeologists must have found,
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, they're quite big for their day, quite big, populated, and they weren't little tribal villages and hamlets. These were big cities.
Sorry, I'm struggling a bit with my light here. It's not very strong.
Oh, sorry.
And the light, the print's very small.
Small, okay.
Even with my glasses on, it's not. However, That's just by the way.
Well, let me take a few moments to suggest some lessons we can learn from this, and then we can discuss it if you want. Three things. I want us to look at what this teaches us about God, what this teaches us about Sodom, and what it teaches us about Lot. First of all, about God, fairly briefly, but I think is very, very obvious. We must see, of course, at every point of this story, the hand of God involved.
Yes.
It's Yahweh himself who stands with Abraham and reveals what he's going to do in chapter 18. Abraham intercedes with him for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's God's messengers who go with God's authority down to the cities. It's them who protect Lot from the men of Sodom, who rescue Lot and his family the following day. It's these angels who literally take them by the scruff of the neck to get them out of the city. It's God who rained down fire and sulfur. It's God who overthrew the cities. It wasn't just a natural disaster. This was an act of direct divine judgment. As an interesting phrase that I pointed out to you in verse 24, the Lord, Yahweh, rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord, Yahweh, out of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a strange turn of phrase. One old church council, going back many, many centuries, understood it as another statement of the plurality of the Godhead.
Mm-hmm.
So this statement says, God the Son brought down the rain from God the Father. And of course, the Bible tells that when God judges, he delegates judgment to God the Son. That's not just true at the end of time, it's true all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
And remember this Christophany that appeared to Abraham in chapter 18, who is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. So we could read as Christ said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Of course, when God acts as a Trinity, every person of the Godhead is involved. But the Bible often identifies one element of action with one person of the Trinity. But judgment, when we read about judgment in the Bible, it's actually Christ involved.
Mm-hmm.
So we read, for example, that perhaps 1 million people who died in the wilderness over those 40 years were told that Christ put them to death. Here we're told implicitly that Christ called down from heaven fire and sulfur on these cities. And again, it's a reminder to us, this is unpleasant stuff. It's not stuff we want to dwell on, but it's a reminder to us that, God of the Old Testament is no different from the God of the New Testament and vice versa. And people who have this sort of wishy-washy picture of Jesus as the meek and mild, we need to remind them that he is not only the one who will cast them into judgment at the end of time, he's the one who has already exercised terrible judgment on the world. And I mean terrible in human language, of course, not in divine terms.
Mm-hmm.
So this is God at work. There can be no other explanation for this.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just think about Sodom for a moment. This is one of the most infamous records and one of the most frequently used illustrations of God's judgment in the Bible. In fact, I'm pretty convinced there's not a single incident in the whole of the history of the Old Testament that made a stronger impression on the people of Israel than Sodom and Gomorrah. They keep going back to it. And that's part of the point of it, because God's judgments are meant to be a warning to subsequent generations. If I tell you that this incident is mentioned in Deuteronomy, in Amos, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Zephaniah, in Lamentations, in Ezekiel, in Matthew, in Luke, in Romans, in Peter, in Jude, and in Revelation. That's how iconic, if I could use that word, this incident is. Some 20 times in Scripture, it's referred to as an image of God's dealings with persistent sin. The very names have become synonyms for extremes. The word sodomy, for example, we don't hear it so much today, but it's a word for homosexual behavior. It comes from Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how iconic this place is. And they're also used as an example of those who willfully sin against the revelation they have been given. Now, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah should have known better. Remember, you go back to chapter 14, these people had been delivered when Abraham intervened after the battles with the kings in the east. Remember, Abraham chased them and he rescued the people of these cities. These cities, these events took place about 450 years after Noah had lived and preached righteousness, and only about 100 years or so after Noah had died. And at the same time as these things happened, Shem, Noah's son from the ark, was still alive. So there's still alive a generation of people who are aware of Noah's message of righteousness and judgment, of at least 3 men who'd lived through it, and the people of those cities must have known about that. The point being made is that their guilt and their judgment is all the more deserved and worse because it was, to some extent, a judgment against, sin in the light of what they knew about God. And Jesus in Matthew 10 uses them as an example of those who willfully despise the word of God, setting it on one side. So there's a powerful illustration here, friends, of the principle of the degrees of judgment based on the revelation that people have received. The greater the revelation, the greater the judgment that people will experience, either in this life, of course, but ultimately, of course, at the end of time. And the other thing we ought to mention here, and we can't not see this in the culture in which we live today, here's a clear example of the perversion of homosexual relationships and God's violent opposition to it. It's not a small thing for God. It's a salutary lesson for our day and generation. And it's interesting too, if you hear some of the people, even some professing Christians, want to say that it wasn't because these people were immoral or because these people were homosexual. And they go to 2 verses in Ezekiel 14, which says that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah also, quote, had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty. Now, that's clearly also part of the reason for their judgment. But what these unbelievers and liberals want to do is say it wasn't because of the homosexual perversion they were judged, it was because they weren't very good at exercising hospitality, which is just to distort the word of God, of course. It's clear from Genesis 19 and elsewhere in Scripture that the judgment of God was primarily because of the unnatural flesh and the sexual promiscuity. And then thirdly, I'd like to think just a couple of minutes about Lot. He's a very interesting character, and it's very easy simply to discard him and write him off. But he's a complex character, and we have to hold in tension some different biblical views on this man. You see, we know from there's a progression we've discovered already without perhaps noting it very much. In Genesis 13, in that discussion with Abraham, Lot looked towards Sodom. He looked in that area. He saw that it was attractive to the eye. He was talking about the fertile land and all the rest of it. Come to chapter 14, verse 12. 13, verse 12. We're told that Lot settled in Sodom. Come to 14, verse 12. We discover that Lot is dwelling in Sodom. You see the progression. He sees it. It looks attractive to his eye, at least on the surface. He moves near it. He becomes a citizen of Sodom. And then we discover at the beginning of chapter 19 that he's a leader within Sodom. He's sitting in the city gate. It's a telling story of a man who is a very mixed character. But it's also clear from 2 Peter chapter 2. Let me read these 2 verses from 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7. Righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous souls over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. And he described the intentions of the local people when he spoke the angelic visitors as wicked. So here's a man, I think the best we can make is, if the Bible calls him righteous, then we have to be very careful how we speak about this man. We cannot write him off as a reprobate. We cannot write him off as an apostate. The Bible says he was righteous. And I think we can make best sense of him by describing us as a man of God who was grieved by the sins around him. That's what 2 Peter tells us, but was not strong enough to completely separate himself from them. He condemned them, he criticized them, he judged them, but there was still part of him that was drawn toward it. Because we have to live with a biblical record and description of this man. And as I was thinking about it, even just today, here's what came to my mind, which I think is a biblical explanation, if you like. I think Lot is like a man in Psalm 1. Blessed is a man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, or stands in the way of sinners, or sits in the seat of scoffers. And that's a progression. Who walks not their way of life, who walks not the way of the wicked. And Lot, I think, is a man, as I understand it, who began to walk with and live with godless people. Whatever he thought of them, he began to associate with them. And what happens when you do that is your standards get blurred. Your judgment gets impaired for all sorts of reasons. And from walking in the counsel of the wicked, you can, if you're not careful, end up sitting in the seat of scoffers. And sitting in the Bible is a position of authority. Remember, Jesus sat in the synagogue to teach. And here's Lot sitting in the gate. And he may have said, I don't agree with them on those decisions. I don't agree with their way of life. But he's still there. That's the problem. And it seems to me that Lot has been on a slippery slope that he's not been strong enough, at the very least, to get off. And without forcing a connection, I think, too, there's a connection here with what we've been thinking about these past 2 Sunday mornings in Matthew 6. You see, what you value affects your vision. It affects the way you see life. And your vision will determine and reveal where your master is. And I think Lot, at the very least, is a man who tried to serve 2 masters. I have to go back and say he's still, in the Bible's eyes, a righteous man. We can't get away from that. But we cannot for a moment condone or excuse what seems to be a great weakness on his part. I say, even the morning after the angels reveal their intention, he's still reluctant to leave. So